Welcome to the 10th episode of Tokyo Alumni Podcast. Today is our last episode, actually, season 1. Our guest today graduated ASIJ in 2008. She attended Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, where she graduated with a Bachelor's in Health and Science in 2012 and continued on to complete her Master's in Occupational Therapy in 2014. From 2014 to 2016, she worked at a nonprofit as an occupational therapist in Boston, working with at-risk adolescent youths. From 2016 to 2018, she took a traveling OT job where she worked at hospitals, nursing homes, and schools throughout the New England region until settling on a full-time OT position at a school for special education in Connecticut. In 2018, she returned to Tokyo, unbeknown to her at the time, to start her own practice. What was initially intended to be a 6-month break to travel, study yoga, meditate, and learn and how to bake French bread turned into a permanent move to build a rewarding practice in her home country to help children of all ages be as independent as possible in navigating their own lives. Welcome to the podcast, Aya.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this today.
So today, we're going to talk mostly occupational therapy, some things about being both Japanese and American, which you are and I am, and a little bit about yoga, which is going to be very hopefully insightful to me because I've always wanted to do yoga, but I have no idea about what yoga entails. But let's go ahead and just start off with occupational therapy. What started this interest in occupational therapy?
So when I was a junior in high school, I would, like many students, was trying to figure out where I wanted to go to college and what I wanted to study. And at that time, I was incredibly concrete in my thinking in that I wanted my degree in college to directly translate into a job. So a good example is you want to be a teacher, get your master's in teaching, you can teach. You have the credentials to teach. You want to be a doctor, go to medical school. You want to be a nurse, go to nursing school. And so I knew that was the path I needed to take to have just a sense of order and control with everything. And for the longest time, I knew I always wanted to work with children, but being a teacher wasn't quite what I wanted to do. Like I really wanted that one-to-one experience or like 3-to-1 experience, working really closely with children. And it was that conversation and discussion I had my junior year in high school with my guidance counselor at the time, Jackie Tolan. And she said, maybe you want to be an occupational therapist. At that point, I had never heard that term before or that profession. And she kind of briefly described to me that her daughter was an occupational therapist. She, I think, worked in Europe at the time at an international school, and that she specifically worked with kids at a, one-to-one or a very intimate setting. So she said, your homework is just look up occupational therapy. And if it's something that you think you want to do, let's look up some schools that you think you might like, and we'll, come back in a week. So I went home, I Googled occupational therapy, and in the most simplest of terms, like what is occupational therapy? It's a type of therapy that helps people be as independent as possible. And so that's incredibly general and incredibly vague. But what's really great about it is that it's a health profession that works in hospitals, schools, nursing homes, private practices, which is what I now do. And you can work with babies to adults. So it's a very big range of a health profession working in many different people. And again, I only described a couple of settings, but there's significantly way more setting, clinics. And after reading just the website on the American Occupational Therapy website, I was like, yes, this is what I want to do. I have found the answer. So from there, I took a look at what the requirements were at that time. And at the time I had applied for schools, there was a push for you have to have a master's degree in order to be a certified and registered therapist to be able to practice. So I looked at schools specifically that had this combined bachelor's master's degree, where if you completed the bachelor part, you just automatically matriculated to the master's program. And so I had only actually applied to 4 colleges that fit that specific criteria. And Quinnipiac University just happened to come up in my searches. And when I had gone back to talk to Jackie Tolan about it, she was like, oh, great, look at this. Quinnipiac University is also a school I had in mind for you if you were going to pursue OT. So I think like that's the fit. And then, the rest, it panned out in a way that really worked for me. Like after I had visited the college, I knew this was the school I really wanted to go to, because in addition to, again, wanting that concrete, what I study in undergrad and college will translate to a job, I also wanted to be at a school that was suburban, away from a big city, just everything was on campus, and Quinnipiac fit that bill.
Wow, that's some real high-level high school counseling there. That her conversation with you actually, affected you that greatly. When you pursued this path, one thing that really intrigues me is we were off air talking a little bit about how, some people know what they want to do at the end of high school, but most don't.
Yeah.
Throughout your journey from this moment where you had this pivotal conversation with your counselor to basically currently where you do pursue it as a career, were there any points where you considered maybe I don't want to do OT?
It's so interesting that you say that. So yeah, as soon as I discovered OT, I knew this is what I wanted to do, and I really wanted to stick with it. And interestingly enough, my parents were a little worried. They thought that it would be too specialized. They thought that, once I went down this path, there was no turning back, and that I wouldn't be able to change my mind. So my parents actually wanted to pull the reins back a little bit and be like, hey, instead of specializing on this one part, how about you go to college to get a breadth of knowledge? Because that's when you really think about what was the original point of attending college, it was all about improving your communication skills, your critical thinking skills, your problem solving skills, and in order to ascertain a certain breadth of knowledge to be able to work, be a functioning provider, and take any job. And then the purpose of graduate school was to then specialize and hone in those things. So interestingly enough, that is the path that my parents had wanted me to do. And at that point, I was just so certain and passionate about it that like any rebellious teenager, I decided to double down on everything and move forward. But to answer your question, was there any point for me to actually quit? And the answer is yes. So after I graduated with my bachelor's, my university actually requires you to do 3 internships. And the first one I did was right after my graduating with my bachelor's, first internship for 12 weeks. And then you continue on in the master's program for 1.5 years, and then finish off with 2 more internships. And that first internship actually was terrible. I was at a public school in New York City working in downtown, and while the kids were wonderful and the experience, the facilities and all that was great, my supervisor was really burnt out and an unhappy person. And as a result, I kind of got the back end of that. And being around her really made me question, is this something that I want to continue to do and want to pursue? And I was very conflicted, because I was really just to a degree, just really hurt and emotionally burdened by that experience. In the end, what I did to overcome it was I went to go see a therapist to really process that experience. I took a look at what my responsibilities were at that time. And at that time I was had I returned to grad school, I was going to be a resident assistant on campus. And that's about a 24-hour-a-week job in addition to grad school. So after kind of taking a look at all my priorities, and I'm thinking, 1.5 years and then I'll be done with my master's. Worst case scenario, I'll graduate with a master's degree in occupational therapy, but I could probably take a non-clinical job. I could probably work in a hospital doing medical records and things like that. So I decided to at least just stick with it, and realize that I couldn't let one 12-week experience at that point, derail what at that time was, my 5-year plan to graduate with my master's. And so by sticking with it, I was able to get just exposure from, other parts of the profession, meet with other professionals, and and really just sharing that experience helped with, in terms of validating that there are therapists out there that I think come into the profession with all the best intents and purposes, but if they don't take care of themselves, it can really cause burnout and then bring out the worst qualities in you that not only affect yourself, but affects your work, affects the people that you work with, whether they're clients or colleagues.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That there were moments of doubt, but you kept powering through.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to occupational therapy, as you mentioned, again, this was also off air. I think when people say, I became a police officer or like a nurse, or I became a teacher, I think they have an idea of what that job entails. So, what is the day to day? What does the day to day, or really minute to minute schedule look like? And are there different categories? Because I do have a few friends who are speech therapists, and I know it's very different working with. It seems to be two extremes. Either they're working with elderly people who are sort of on the tail end of their life, or they're working with young people who are obviously just getting started. So what does it look like in the field of OT?
So specifically, I work with children. And so for most pediatric occupational therapists, what they're doing is that they look at a child's development and see if that compares to what is typical development. And I say typical with quotes because really there is a range, for it. And a good example is babies can take anywhere, but they say about a year old is when babies start to walk. But 8 months, you can be at 8 months and start walking. You can be at 14 or 16 months and start walking, and that's normal. And there is a range of what's typical and atypical. And so what I do is I take a look at, and I would say right now I see mostly first and second graders, because that's where you see some of the divide of kids who are just kind of moving along gingerly and kids who are struggling. And so I take a look at those everyday skills that you need to be successful in first grade. So when you think about what do you need to be able to do in first grade? You need to be able to hold a pencil. You need to be able to write your name. You need to be able to hold scissors and cut them, cut with scissors appropriately so you can keep up with whatever the task is in art class, or whatever the writing assignment is or the spelling, keeping up with the spelling test. I don't know if you do spelling tests in first grade, but things like that. And there's significantly more to that. But typically what parents will say is, he just can't get the homework done. He says that his hand hurts. We start to cry. We have these meltdowns. And so when I take a look at that behavior, it's in addition to breaking down, all right, what are the difficulties with fine motor skills that is interfering with it? I also take a look at what could be going on with the body that's causing this disorganization. So while the problems might be I can't cut with scissors, it could also be because, there is a disconnect with the brain, really coordinating those actions with the body and the limbs, that is making things difficult. So I work with, so I try to I try to figure out what could be those underlying issues in the body that's interfering with that. And then finding that, creating specific exercises to help with that brain body connection that then translate into improving that, that functional skill of, all right, improve with writing or cutting with scissors. And so that's the thought process. So then what does an actual session look like? It usually starts with a lot of movement. So I'll have a kid move around to help with coordinating their body. And from an outsider's view, it kind of looks like I'm just playing with the kid and being really playful. And that's a huge part of it, because play is a really important aspect of any child's growth and development. So it might even just be we walk around the room like a crab, and then we will crawl around the room like a bear. And then I sometimes bring in other equipment, spinning equipment and sound and music-based equipment to, again, help target those specific body functions that help organize the body in a way that then makes those functional movements for handwriting to be more easier. And then at the very end of these sessions, we'll do like some hand strengthening exercises, whether it's using a certain type of resistant putty to make some shapes, roll into a snake or make a snail or cut the putty. And then finally we end these sessions with like functional tasks of handwriting or drawing or cutting to make a craft activity, because it's that activity is what really pulls all those skills together. And then over time, what I see and families see is that improvement in the ability to do the work, because now the actions to actually do so aren't cumbersome. And again, and with the intention of like me no longer having to prompt or cue these things, they can just self-initiate and do these tasks on their own without, having to rely on an adult for help or supervision.
So when it comes to, working on, it seems like it encompasses a pretty big part of the child's development, from physical to mental. When I talk to, people who are a little older than me, it seems like the new sets of infrastructure we have, whether it's speech therapy, occupational therapy, that help the development of children, it's obviously got a lot better. So again, going back to when I talk to people older than me, you hear these horror stories of I actually knew a guy who taught English, and when he was younger, he just did really poorly, and it turns out he finds out in his 20s he had dyslexia. And like, obviously that wouldn't happen today, because, well, it probably still does, but at least to a much lesser extent, because there's these safety nets that catch, they notice these issues. So going along that line of thinking, is there something that often comes about over and over in occupational therapy, that a student comes in and it's like, and the diagnosis is, this student can't, sit still, or can't, there's a problem with their motor skills.
Yeah.
Is there something that often is very much overlooked, and it seems to be very frequent?
Yeah. I'm so glad you asked that, because I can't tell you how many times I have, actually really frequently too, I would say the last couple of my referrals I've had, the family will say, our kid is super coordinated, like really great in sports, really strong, does organize sports really, really well, but just can't sit still and do his, can't sit still in class, can't do their homework, can't organize anything. And I just don't understand, because they do organize sports really well and they follow those rules, they follow those directions, what's going on. And I want to say 9 out of 10 times that is a body core connection issue. And when I say core, I mean like not just your abs, but really your body plane of what goes down from the top of your head here down to your tailbone, just that body awareness of like, where is my body from left and right, front and back, and how does my body in space affect my relationship with my environment? And that is something that's so commonly overlooked by many professions. And again, if you're actually not specifically trained in that type of information and knowledge, OTs can miss it as well. And so whenever I have a family that does that, comes with those complaints, I'm like, all right, let's take a look at their core. And usually parents are like, no, you don't understand. My kid is strong. Like he can, do 15 push-ups and can do sit-ups. It's not his core. And it's like, and again, it's like while he might have the strength and muscle because he's been, he has that muscle memory and that exercise, it doesn't mean he knows where his body is and where his relationship to his body is. And if that's what's impacting you and it's taking up 90% of your brain power, then absolutely, you don't have enough in your reserves to listen to the classroom, to listen to what the teacher is saying, because all these other factors are coming in and interfering with that. So that's a really big one that I see is, People like to chalk it up to it's sensory, and that's a really big buzzword in the occupational therapy profession, is like sensory integration, or it's a sensory issue. And when we think about what sensory is, we have the five senses, smell, taste, touch, see, hearing, but there are other body-centered senses, your ability to feel pressure or pain or touch. These are other things that our body is constantly interacting with, and if we're not able to shut off that the attention to that, then we have no ability to learn. And to ask a first or second grader like to despite those challenges to learn anyway, they're going to constantly struggle. So that's probably the biggest thing I see with families. And then the second one I'll see is, again, going back to the senses, they'll say that it's called vestibular sense, and that is your ability to sense movement. So when you are, and a good example is when you're on a roller coaster, and you get that, like when you dip down and you feel like that whoop feeling in that.
Yeah, I hate that feeling. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's your vestibular sense kicking in, being like, I register that. Ugh. And then your response is, I like it, I hate it, or I feel really neutral. A really good one too is when you're dizzy. If you are in a moving car, you're feeling motion sickness. When you're feeling that dizziness, that's again your vestibular system saying, hey, I'm getting a little too much input, and if you don't stop, we're going to have problems. And I have a lot of parents who come in with issues that are pertaining to the vestibular sense. So they say, my kid can't walk down the stairs without either holding my hand or holding on the armrest. And, going up and down the stairs is a nightmare. Sometimes we have meltdowns, or he won't go on certain play structures because, he keeps saying that he's scared, and I don't understand why. He seems like he's constantly, dizzy or nauseous or doesn't like to move. I don't know why. And that tends to be an issue with the vestibular sense that I think, again, commonly overlooked if you don't know when to look for it.
Yeah, that's really intriguing. That I didn't know that was the word, vestibular.
Yeah.
Vestibular sense. Wow. So yeah, that's really intriguing. And you learned all this in the States, even though you spent most of your life in Japan. You grew up in a bilingual family. When you went to the States and you studied, as well as now that you're back in Japan, were there any difficulties you faced being like an international school student / American, but you're / Japanese? You know what I mean? There's all these, different nuances coming from ASIJ. What was your experience like in college?
So I was incredibly fortunate growing up while I was in Tokyo to go back to the States very frequently for summer and winter vacations. And during that time, my parents, again, did a really great job acclimating myself to the United States, attending summer camps, sleepaway camps, in, various sports camps. So I was, very much so exposed to what I would say is a good representation of American kids, because again, the sports camps and the sleepaway camps had a really great diverse population of students. So from there, I was really able to pick up some of the social nuances and the slang that definitely, and although this was all in California, definitely helped me when I moved to Connecticut when I started college. And, I typically just introduced myself as, hi, my name is Aya, I'm from Japan. And then they'd be like, oh, why do you speak English so well? Or they're like, wow. And because I would say that for schools in, at least my school, in the New England area, when you say that you're from a foreign country, they really do expect that a different type of international student, that maybe English is not their first language and they didn't grow up in this, bicultural, multicultural community. So they have a very specific impression of what an international student was, which I didn't quite fit the bill for that. And so then I would just quickly say, oh, my dad's American. We spoke English at home. I went to international school. And I would say, and then I would kind of top it off with like, but California is my American home, for them to kind of just understand, okay, so like you are an American, and I guess I can now put you in this comfortable box, who you are, so I can make sense of it. And interestingly enough, at least from my experience when I was at Quinnipiac, I only made friends with one third culture kid. who went to international school, and that person actually ended up transferring because she felt like Quinnipiac didn't have that big diverse mindset in terms of for that like community. So she ended up going to a different school after our freshman year of college. And again, interestingly enough too, when I attended QU, I had another classmate who graduated, she was originally from the Connecticut area, but graduated from ASIJ, and we went to QU together. And we both had very different experiences as a result. And I think, again, it was a lot of dynamics into play. I think by that point, when I was 18, I was ready to experience a new experience of college. And I think this other person, her family was still in Japan, and she very much so had that homesickness feeling. That was a little bit of a segue, a little side note. But then going back to it, in terms of identity, I did experience a lot of, I guess what I would say is code switching. It's when you would change your language to help adjust to the community that you're in. And I did notice those differences in terms of what New England is like and the West Coast, where, people are very proud to be from that New England area. People are very much so tie their identity to sports teams and what state they're from. And someone from Long Island is very different from someone from Boston, and you could never mix those two apart. Like, and that's another thing too, like mistaking somebody from Long Island, New York and Staten Island, New York, you're going to be looking for some problems. But again, I feel like that code switching of just speaking in English in that New England way and, omitting certain words and changing parts of my speech to, again, I think help me acclimate and just feel a sense of belonging. Because otherwise, I mean, I guess like look at you funny or just be like, oh, where are you from? I can tell that you're not from here, which was fine. But I just felt like it was easier at times just to make myself a chameleon and blend in.
I think the challenges are unique being in Japan versus the US. And you've spent, roughly half of the last 6 years, right, in the US versus Japan. Do you find living in one of the two countries easier than the other, just in regards to that scope? Obviously, there's a lot of elements, I imagine, like financial and whatnot. But omitting all those other parts, if it's just the social aspect, do you find one country to be easier to sort of acclimate to?
So in terms of feeling a sense of social belonging, I think living in Japan is easier because, and maybe it's also coming from a bias of what's familiar to me, but when Japanese people ask me, oh, are you half? I say yes, and they're like, oh, and then they kind of fill in the blanks, but it's a very accepting, like, oh, okay, that's so great, like, oh, and then, they talk about how great it is to have this biracial background and this half background, half identity. It's very cool. You can speak English and Japanese. And then being around foreigners or other half kids in Japan, they understand because we have a shared similar experience. And so in terms of social belonging, I think living in Japan was easier. And whereas in the US, while like on the outside, on the exterior, it was very easy to make friends. Like I never had issues with making friends. I think I was very easily accepted by everybody because, again, of just the way that I look, the way that I present, I'm articulate, and I'm easy to understand. I think I put people at ease. But in terms of did I feel like I socially belonged with people within their groups, I felt like there was a barrier. And that barrier, possibly that barrier might have come from me feeling like you don't really understand me. I don't really feel seen. But also feeling on the opposite side, I think them not fully understanding my identity when I share it with them. And I can really only say, like, I have a handful of friends from college that I really do have that strong connection with, that I feel like is very similar to my experiences with people in Japan.
Obviously, there's different challenges in each country, but in the US, my perspective has always been its strength has sort of been my weakness. And what I mean by that is I feel like anyone can become American, quite literally, right? If you live there, I have an aunt who, she was Japanese until her 50s, and then she became American feeling that, we are all American because we grew up here, because we were, so if you're talking to an 18-year-old, because you spent the last 18 years in the States, you're an American. So because I didn't do my 18 years, even though kind of like you, I spent almost every summer in the States, it was always kind of like, yeah, but you're not really from here. And I know nowadays there's a lot of study about things like microaggressions, et cetera. And that stuff really doesn't really bother me as much. I don't, I think there's bigger fish to fry, but I do, for me, I kind of, as you said, I felt like I was never really truly part of the American tribe.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I definitely experienced that. The microaggressions of like, where are you from? And there are times where I just be in a setting where I didn't feel like divulging my life story real quick. So I would say like, oh, I'm from California, or I'm from Connecticut, or, or I just somewhere from out of state, or, or somewhere where there might've been a higher Asian population, just so people would be like, oh yeah, okay. But then I would get the follow-up of like, well, where are you really from? And because at the end of the day, like, it's like, well, I have an American passport. Where are you really from too? And I could just give it right back. But yeah, no, so absolutely those microaggressions were very common. And actually, and especially working in healthcare, you do get that a lot. And as I said, I definitely benefit from looking and passing white. That I think that puts people at ease. Like that racial bias in healthcare is very true. And especially if you're a healthcare provider. And I would say probably people who are older, more in their like 60s and 70s, like and up, that's where you would get the questions of like belonging and social belonging. Where are you from? Type things. And I guess now hindsight, really looking at it, it's just a great opportunity to educate people. Moving forward, I could probably do a better effort in doing that instead of being defensive at times, which I've definitely felt.
In your occupation, you do some yoga.
Yeah.
Soccer players have notorious reputations for being not flexible and, not being good at yoga. So I was wondering, what are just some like basic things for someone who's a total novice like me? I'm about 5 inches, 6 inches from touching my toes. So what's like a easy way for someone to ease into it? Like,
I think connecting to your breath is the first and foremost most important part of yoga. And I think that's something that's very overlooked when people start doing yoga or get into yoga, is they do the poses and the movement, but they forget to connect to their breath. And and when I started yoga, it was because I was really, actually, interestingly enough, when I had mentioned the bad internship and I needed to find ways to cope better, that's actually when I found yoga and started my yoga journey. But I initially did it as like a form of exercise. And it wasn't until when I really connected my breath to those movements that really changed everything for me and for really positive benefits. So the very first thing I think is really important is just connecting to your breath. And the best way I think to do that is to be able to feel your breath. So I'm going to move a little bit so you can see, right? Putting your hands at the top of your rib cage right here and taking a deep breath and expanding the ribs. And really, when you breathe in, press your ribs into your hand and gently press your hands into your ribs. And then exhale, bring the ribs in and really pulling your low belly in, so that you start to feel your core engage and connect. And then just repeat, inhale, expand the ribs, exhale, pull the low belly in. Doing that 4 to 5 times, again, it's just connecting to your body and connecting with that breath can be really powerful. And then if you want to get a little bit more creative, for absolute beginners, I would just say inhale till you're full and then exhale till you're empty and repeat 4 to 5 times. When that becomes a little boring, I increase it to inhale and hold for 5 counts. So it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then exhale completely and then repeat. Those two breath exercises I think would be really wonderful. Another great yoga pose. I also like suggesting these too, because anyone can do these, especially not just for exercise, but if you work at a desk or if you're on the computer for long periods of time. It's something that you can easily just break up your day, is shoulder shrugs. And so what that looks like is, again, connecting to the breath. So inhale, take a deep breath. Hold the breath, bring your shoulders up towards your ears, bring the shoulders back, and then exhale, squeeze the tops of the shoulder blades together, bringing the shoulder blades down. And so when you're doing that, it's very easy to want to press your chest out to compensate. You really just want to focus on moving the shoulders. And then there's two more moves for that. So again, with the shoulder shrug. So inhale, take a deep breath across the upper back. Exhale, squeeze the middle parts of the shoulder blades together. Again, just moving the shoulders back. Bring the shoulder blades down. Last one, inhale across the upper back. Exhale, squeeze the bottom tips of the shoulder blades together. And then bring your elbows in towards your rib cage and bring your shoulders down. And that just, again, loosens up parts of the upper body that I think I feel like, again, a lot of people work in desk jobs. So this can really help just break up that. And then for touching your toes a little bit better, I have a really cool trick. If you don't mind waiting 1 second, I'm gonna go grab a toy.
No problem.
Doesn't have to be exactly this, but this size ball. It's about the size of a golf ball. But I think even a tennis ball would work, or a baseball. And what you want to do is put this under the sole of your foot. You can see, like so. And it's just going under the sole of your foot. And if you would just press in your body weight forward and backwards, just through the fleshy part of your foot, go around side to side, as much pressure as you can tolerate. You'll find some nice sore spots. 2-3 minutes of that, and then try touching your toes. I guarantee there'll be some form of difference. So what I would try to do is try to touch your toes without using the ball first. Then rub your feet with the ball on both feet, and then try to touch your toes. And yes, I guarantee you'll notice a little bit of flexibility on that. And just to kind of share the yoga science behind it, is that our body's all connected through connective tissue called fascia. And frequently, like, our hamstrings and calves are tight, just because of everyday wear and tear, moving around. And so when you press certain points on the foot with deep pressure, it creates it's like a trigger point, and it releases some of that tight tissue all the way up to your hamstrings and calf muscles, to then allow you to have a little bit more flexibility. So that's really interesting. The little ball, is that just something people can grab on Amazon, like US? Amazon? I just got this on I got this at a yoga studio, but I'm pretty sure it's available on Amazon. Again, if you don't feel like, if you have like a golf ball lying around the house, it just needs to be small enough to be able to rub underneath your foot. But yeah, it's definitely available on Amazon.
Intriguing. Yeah, those are definitely all very doable as a novice. So I'll keep those in mind. I'll probably go ahead and find one of those on Amazon or something too. So as we wrap up today's conversation, I like at the end to basically give the ball, or the metaphorical, I guess that's a metaphor in itself, the metaphor of the metaphor, to the guest, and have the guest talk about just what's to come in the next few days, next few months, next few years. And I haven't mentioned this yet, and I want to mention this one because it's the 10th episode. Part of this is also just sort of a library, not only for the international school community, but also for individuals. An individual I just interviewed last time, for example, Tom, had a 7-year-old son, and we're just kind of joking out, the internet's forever. So 5 years, 6 years from now, when his son's in middle school, he could look at the YouTube video and see
Yeah.
what that was up to 5-6 years ago. So with that in mind as well, again, thank you for being our season finale for episode 1, Aya. And I want to give the mic to you.
Thank you. So what's to come? Because of COVID, I've had to adjust my schedule a lot. So right now, I was only offering sessions twice a week in person. I've now bumped it back up to 4 days a week, just because of things are starting to reopen up. So I'm resuming back to a more normal schedule of seeing clients face to face. I'm hoping to be able to resume teaching yoga by next month. I've been teaching yoga 3 classes a week on the US Embassy compound. Hopefully that will return. Let's see, in the next 6 months. I mean, I just hope that, I'm hoping, I guess, just to continually still be in business and being able to see kids and help kids. Oh, that's what it is. My original plan in the spring was to actually teach kids yoga at the compound. I had to postpone that because of COVID. So a part of me is hopeful that in the fall I'm able to do that. That's still just up in the air in general because there's just so many unknowns. So if that does get pushed off, I'm hoping that in 2021 I could teach children's yoga at the US compound. I'm considering possibly teaching at certain international schools. It's just that in terms of the time slots that are available doesn't seem like it may work with my schedule, but that would be the biggest one. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for being on the season finale, and hopefully I'll see you around sooner or later, and good luck with all the OT stuff.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nick. I appreciate it.